In 2019, in response to the needs expressed by our community, Adopt for Life began a conversation to better understand issues of aggression towards parents and caregivers by a child or youth. Since that time, countless parents and caregivers have come forward, bravely sharing their stories and experiences and seeking help for their children, youth, and their entire family. We've heard quite clearly that this issue causes immense harm to entire families across Canada. The shame, stigma, grief, and isolation expressed by individuals who were brave enough to speak about this issue is intense. Other countries refer to this issue as child-to-parent violence and aggression, or CPVA, among other acronyms and definitions. When we began this conversation in 2019, we used the term CPVA as a starting point in effort to bring the conversation to light. In 2021, Adopt for Life partnered with Kids Brain Health Network to bring together a cross-Canada consortium of leaders in research, social services, mental health, youth justice, child welfare, and more to explore the breadth of the perspectives that youth and young adults, families, and service partners have on this issue, and to consider how to improve outcomes for Canadian families and their communities. A key outcome of the consortium is the adoption of a new name. That replaces the use of our term CPVA, aggression towards family and caregivers in childhood and adolescence, or AFCCA, AFCCA for short. It focuses on describing behavior, who it's most commonly directed towards, and the stages at which the behavior may occur. The video you're about to watch was created prior to this new naming and still references CPVA. Over time, it will be updated, but please know that the information and learning here is still valid and relevant for families and professionals. Where you hear the term CPVA, consider it as AFCCA, and know that in future version of this video, it will be renamed accordingly. The National Consortium on Aggression Towards Family and Caregivers in Childhood and Adolescence, AFCCA, listened closely to the many voices with lived experience. More than 100 young adults, parents, caregivers, and siblings shared their lived experiences and expertise to shape key learnings and help co-develop recommendations. Adopt for Life remains a proud partner within the consortium. To learn more about AFCCA across Canada, please visit www.afcca-apfea.ca. We are good.
Good morning and welcome to this Adopt for Life webinar on nonviolent resistance. I'm Mary Jo Land, a psychotherapist with a specialty in attachment, trauma, and adoption. But today I'm speaking to you as chair of the Mental Health Committee of Adopt for Life, a not-for-profit organization that supports adoptive, kin, and customary care families in Ontario. For 6 years, Adopt for Life has been working with families. Many of the children in these families have experienced developmental trauma and loss. Some of these families experience child-to-parent violence and aggression. Our hope is that we can take the information that parents have entrusted to us to improve outcomes for children and their families. Over the past year, we've worked closely to learn about international approaches to this issue. Through our journey, we discovered nonviolent resistance as a means for helping families develop skills to improve outcomes for their children. Today, we're lucky to have Peter Jakob, who developed trauma-informed nonviolent resistance, and Dan Dulberger, NVR researcher and trainer, who developed nonviolent resistance for families of adult children with entrenched dependence. Dan recently moved to Canada and intends to bring nonviolent resistance to North America. Welcome, Peter and Dan. Thanks for joining us on our journey. So let's dive in.
Hi, Mary Jo.
What is nonviolent resistance and how was it developed?
Hello, Mary Jo, and thanks for having us here today. Every time I'm asked what NVR is, I tend to come up with a slightly different answer, and I hope that these answers improve with time and with questions. So I thought about what is the simplest way in which I can put what NVR is about, and I came up with the following. NVR is about resisting harm in a caring way together. And I'll say it again, resisting harm in a caring way together. NVR literally stands for nonviolent resistance. And as a therapy approach, it aims to help distressed caregivers. And caregivers, by that I'm referring to any person, community, or institution that cares for people, including adopted, foster, or biological parents, of course. This population is very central, is a majority of our cases in our work. NVR is here to help caregivers who feel that they no longer matter to those whom they care for. Caregivers who feel despaired, effaced, helpless, and alone. Caregivers who no longer feel useful for their cared for. And NVR as an approach is uniquely characterized, I would say, by two things, by two properties. One is its goal, and the other is its mode of operation, or way of attaining that goal. NVR's unique goal is to help caregivers restore their sense of agency and presence in the lives of the people they care for. And NVR's unique mode of operation, the way it aims to restore that it helps caregivers restore their agency and presence by teaching them how to caringly resist violence, self-harm, and disruptive behaviors. When we say caringly, we mean resisting without hurting, harming, or escalating, resisting harm in a way that does not harm. NVR therapy was originally inspired by political nonviolent resistance movements, such as Mahatma Gandhi's movement to liberate India or for Indian independence, or Martin Luther King's movement, and generally the civil rights movements in history. As a therapy, it originally was developed in Israel in the mid-90s by clinical psychologist Chaim Omer. And he did that in response to growing distress by parents who were experiencing extremely violent or coercive behavior from their children. And that was at a much earlier time and much before the abbreviation CPVA was known or was being used. So this is my first take and given generally, and yeah.
So exactly what types of problems is NVR intended to address?
Before we move to that question, I believe that you also asked about trauma-informed NVR and how it is unique. So I'll let Peter address that as well.
Okay. Well, a lot of children and young people who show controlling behavior, harmful behavior, self-destructive behavior, of course, have experienced trauma, have experienced adverse, have had adverse experiences. Often so have their parents, so have many people in the community around them. Kids who get adopted or go into foster care carry the trauma into the relationships. So the trauma doesn't just exist inside the mind of a person alone. It also exists between people. And if trauma exists between people, solutions or the things that we can do that ameliorate trauma also exist between people. And in trauma-informed NVR, we can think of various sort of planes, you know, or various levels. We can think of the community around the nuclear family as one plane of existence of trauma. We can think of the nuclear family itself, and then finally the child. And it can help to imagine that if the nuclear family is going to become an environment in which children and parents recover from trauma, then that nuclear family needs to be anchored in a support network that is emotionally safe for the family. But not only emotionally safe, it also needs to be proactive. It needs to provide active support, the kind of support that helps traumatized parents feel that they have agency, rather than taking over from them or delegating the parental agency somewhere else. Then we can look at the parents themselves utilizing NVR methods in a way that helps them mitigate the effects of trauma on themselves, so that they in turn can really become anchors for their child, you know, so they can carry out that, you know, like Winnicott's container function for the child. In turn, we can then look at the child, and there's a unique area of work in NVR called reconciliation gestures or relational gestures or acts of reconciliation. And they then become pivotal in a child focus in helping parents to address the needs of children, even children who may dismiss the parental care. And that feature of NVR, that we help parents take one-sided action, whether or not the child goes along with that. Parents can also take one-sided action in addressing the unmet needs of the child. And I think that's what makes trauma-informed NVR quite unique among attachment-informed ways of working, looking at those three planes.
Thank you. And so could you be specific about the types of problems that NVR is intended to address?
Yeah, I would say the starting point is harm. So before we look into particular diagnoses or conditions, I think what we're interested in is helping where there are interactions in which a child or a young person or a young adult, a younger adult, controls the family or the children's home, people in the children's home or the foster family, or in the community, acts in controlling ways that result in harm to others, but also in harm to self, or in harm to self. I think that's the starting point, you know, and particularly if the young person in question isn't willing or isn't capable to engage in therapy with the aim of actually changing that harmful behavior in a productive way. So,
And are you able to describe for us the main principles and features of NVR? Oh, Dan, I think you're muted.
I'll try to do that. Before I
Thank
go,
you.
I'll just add a little thing about the types of problems that NVR is intended to address. NVR's primary client is parents and families and caregivers. At the same time, we are very much aware of the impact of caregiving on the cared for. So we're assuming, and we know, that when caregivers do better, when they're more present, when they're more there, when they're more effective, usually that impacts the lives and behaviors and well-being of the cared for. So we're not totally oblivious to the wellness of the cared for. And in each and every one of our cases, we see improvements in whatever it is problematic or unwell with them as a result of caregivers being able to withstand or resist harm in a caring way, in a loving way. Now I'll move over to describing some of NVR's principles. I'll start by saying that NVR is quite a complex practice. It's very hard to cut it down into principles, and there are many versions of NVR's principles or pillars. NVR has many pillars. It depends on who you talk to. I usually try to boil down to 3, and this is what I'll try to do here again in a very simple way because we don't have much time. I would say that NVR is, generally speaking, about the nature of caregiving. It's about giving care. It's a reminder, it's a thought, it's an insight about what caring for others means. And I see it as composed of 3 principles, which I would call the principle of resistance, the principle of love, and the principle of community. The principle of resistance, and I could also call it the principle of autonomous resistance to harm. There are many definitions of caregiving, but I think we would all agree that caregiving is about, among other things, doing no harm. There's no caregiving with doing harm at the same time, quite obviously. The principle of resistance in NVR says it kind of extends the definition of harm in caregiving. And it sees care not just as doing no harm, but also as standing against any form of harm that is associated with a caregiving relationship. You cannot give care to someone if you, at the same time, approve or tolerate harm that is inflicted on the person you care for, or if this person inflicts harm on you, on others, or on themselves. So if a child, for instance, is harming themselves or harming others or harming you, you can't remain this person's caregiver without standing against this harm. And of course, you cannot give care if you're being beaten up. This is a property of caregiving. We don't need permission or consent from the harming person to oppose harm that is being done to them or that they are doing to others or to ourselves or to themselves. So resisting harm is a unilateral and autonomous part of our caregiver identity. When we lose our ability to resist harm, we also compromise our ability to give care. So that's the principle of resistance. The principle of love, or the principle of non-escalation, says that there is only one way to resist harm and yet remain a caregiver. If giving care by definition includes resisting harm, this means we need to find a way of resisting without hurting. And a way of standing, we need a way of standing against violence without causing or creating more violence or victimhood. In other words, the principle of resistance and the principle of love taken together say that we can only give care by resisting harm, and we can only resist harm as caregivers by doing it in a non-escalating, non-harmful way. So these are the first 2 principles, and then comes the principle of community. Caregiving is almost invariably a relationship. True, people can also self-care, but when we usually talk about caregiving, we talk about a relationship between people. So caregiving is essentially a social act. It's part of being social. It rests on being social. Even when it's done in one-on-one, it's always between people. care that is given in isolation is vulnerable care. The more we care together, the better and stronger is our care. The more immune or resistant it is, or resilient it becomes to any attempt to disrupt it. Shared care can better resist harm in a non-harmful way. So that is the principle of community. And if we take these three principles together, then we can reach a kind of a characterization, a one-sentence characterization of NVR as resisting harm in a caring way together. So this is one possible take on NVR's principles.
That's lovely. Could you just say that again? Resisting harm.
Resisting harm in a caring way together.
That's really lovely.
Yeah.
So in this new way of approaching behavior, do the children find it upsetting? Like, how do they respond?
Well, they don't always like it. But it's really interesting because sometimes therapists say, well, you know, how can you do these things if the child objects, you know? And sometimes social workers ask the children, you know, what do you think about the NVR intervention? And if the child doesn't approve of the NVR intervention, then maybe it's wrong, you know. But of course, it's natural that parents do things that their children don't like, not all the time. But I think parents, when parenting works, go through the process of distinguishing between wants and needs. And I think that's a constant process. You know, we parents talk to other parents about that to get help with that process of distinction. And it's only when control of the family by the child has become the organizing principle of family life that the child's wants become imperative. And often when we think of children who've been traumatized, we worry, you know, that if the child is unhappy with what parents are doing, then maybe we're troubling the child. But actually it's a sign of progress when parents move back into distinguishing between wants and needs and seek to address needs of the child as best they can understand them.
So the next question I have for you is, what gap does nonviolent resistance fill for families who are experiencing child-to-parent violence and aggression?
I think I can address that. And Peter, please feel free to jump in as well. I would categorize two main gaps that families experience. There are many gaps, but I'm talking about two main categories of gaps. The first gap is between what families or parents feel they know, they believe, they're capable of, the way they were brought up, their belief systems, and the challenges that are actually put to them by children. Children who do not behave in ways which parents can feel that they can anticipate and find solutions for. The second type of gap, at the same time, is between what parents believe, aim for, wish, expect themselves to do, and what various existing approaches can offer to them, can actually guide them through to do. There are things that work, but NVR obviously comes in when things don't work. I think there's a very simple way even simpler way to answer your question. The gap that NVR fills for families experiencing child-to-parent violence and aggression is the parents themselves, is the parenthood. Families experiencing child-to-parent violence and aggression are families where the parental role has been eroded, overwhelmed, shocked, erased. The parents that we meet, the parents that come to us and have been coming to us for more than 20 years now, are parents who are very much can be compared to trauma victims, dissociated people, disenfranchised, people who have lost their way. They don't feel they are seen by their children, and often they also feel that they're not seen by the wider mental health environment. They feel that if they are seen as kind of instruments or levers to benefit the child, a channel to modify the child's behavior, a way of improving the child's attachment style, maybe. But they don't feel that often they don't feel that they are seen as parents or as people in their own right. And NVR fills that gap by helping parents recover their very stature as parents, their role, their presence, their own wellness, if necessary. This is how I would characterize the gap. Peter, how do you see this?
I think I couldn't put it better than you just did. So I would agree with you. I think you used the word erasure, and so many parents say that they feel as if they did not exist, at least in that capacity as parent.
Yeah.
You know, they've lost parenting. You know, I remember one parent who said, I'm just a hull. I'm just a, I'm not there. Yeah. And I think bringing that parent self back into existence, I think that is the gap that NVR fills, both in terms of resisting harm and in terms of caring and addressing their child's needs. And I think there's an aspect there. I think parents need to feel resonance with their child, and often they're denied that resonance because of the fraught relationship, because of the ruptures in the relationship, and they need to feel they matter. And many of the parents that we work with have lost that sense that they matter to the child and to others, often to each other, as a couple, to the siblings, and I think that gap, we fill that gap. NVR fills that gap.
Yes, because parents, families can feel so isolated, isolated and alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. But do you worry that speaking about child-to-parent violence could stigmatize the child?
Right. Well, I'm sort of thinking of a little boy who was permanently excluded from mainstream school. And when we reintegrated him, we worked very hard at reintegrating him into mainstream school. But other kids wouldn't play with him. And the foster carer who came to pick him up would look away rather than making eye contact with other parents because she felt ashamed. And other parents would talk about the boy and about her, and she would sense them talking about her and the boy. And the boy was not allowed to play soccer, for example, because they were worried that he, hurt other kids. But it was put in caring language, like he cannot cope with playing ball. When actually what happened was that when someone else got the ball, he would kick them and punch them. So the stigmatization and the shaming was a reaction that happened within the social environment, whether or not we'd speak about violence. And what we actually did was we worked towards reintegrating him. So, for example, we worked with something that in NVR is called vigilant care. A teaching assistant would run along with him during the football training and take him out when he started what they called fizzing, when he started fizzing, you know, when they could anticipate that he'd get aggressive, he took him out and then he brought him back in. So we work in a reintegrative capacity. Stigmatizing reactions and shaming reactions are exclusionary reactions. They push the child out of the family, out of the community, out of the community of the school and so forth. In NVR, the message is, you know what you did, that was violent. We can't accept that. You belong to us. You are part of us, which is why that's got to stop. And so you could almost visualize it like this. This is the hand that holds back against the violence. And this is the arm that encloses the child in the community, you know. And that is very, very different from a stigmatizing effect. There's another aspect of it, and that is, I'll give you another example. I was chairing a meeting between two parents and a group of people who we were hoping would become supporters of the family. And one of the people, one of the boys' uncles said, who had heard that the boys are difficult. Yeah, they show challenging behavior. That was the term that was used. And he said, oh, well, you know, boys will be boys, won't they? And I could just see the mother's face drop and an inhibition to name what was going on. And I said to her, could you share what happened yesterday? And she described a violent assault, a serious assault on her that happened in the afternoon. And then later that day, she described that her son came after her with a hot iron. And there was a gasp, and the uncle said, oh, I didn't realize it's that serious. And then I invited the parents to talk about some of the things that they'd started doing to resist this aggression, this violence. But also to talk about how they were doing it in a way that is coming back to the stigma and the shaming, that is non-stigmatizing, non-shaming, and caring. And at some point, the uncle said, what can I do? So the parents needed the freedom to actually break the silence. And it's the silence over the problem behavior that enables it. But there's that real distinction between, we would not ever speak of violent children. We would speak of children who behave violently. There's a huge difference. Violence is not seen as a personality characteristic of the child. Violence is seen as a habitual response of the child in certain situations. Habits take about 9 weeks. There's a lot of empirical research on that. Habits take about 9 weeks to form or to reform. Interestingly, that's about 10 NVR sessions. When we're looking at traumatized kids and parents, we're looking often at a longer period. But it's interesting that NVR was laid out to be about 10 sessions initially, and that's about the length of time it takes to change a habit.
Thank you, Peter. Some of us here in this community are DADIC developmental psychotherapists. And I wonder if you could help us understand the, how DDP and NVR fit together, are the same, different?
Well,
Could you
I mean,
expand on that?
yeah, here in the UK, by the way, I live in the UK in spite of my accent. Here in the UK, we have many DDP practitioners, and those who get involved in NVR tend to feel very much at home with child-focused NVR. So I think child-focused NVR, as I practice it, and some of my colleagues practice it, it kind of brings attachment thinking into NVR. Yeah. So we're particularly interested in how do we utilize those nonviolent methods in a practical way to repair rupture in relationships, to help the child also learn to repair rupture in relationships. How do we utilize reconciliation gestures to show one-sided, caring, loving acts which address unmet child need in a number of areas: sense of belonging, sense of safety and security, a more coherent and positive attachment narrative, story of the family and oneself, and autonomy, the child's autonomy, age appropriate autonomy, or autonomy that's appropriate to the developmental stage of the child. So those are areas where we've brought attachment thinking into NVR. Chaim Omer, who initially developed NVR with his team in Tel Aviv, has also developed a really important concept that's gone from NVR, or hopefully is going into attachment theory, which he calls the anchoring function of attachment. And it goes back to Bowlby's ideas that a child needs not only a kind and caring and loving attachment figure, but also a strong attachment figure. And the idea of strength in NVR is really, really interesting. We think a lot about how is strength different from imposing one's will upon someone else? How is strength different from overpowering, And what are the relational qualities of strength? If you think about, for example, research on disorganized attachment, we see that hostile responses to a child or anxious responses to a child tend to be implicated in the development of disorganized attachment, And in NVR, we help parents to stop being victims. We help parents to stop escalating with children. And then in child-focused NVR, we look at utilizing the one-sided action that the parents can take to enable that reconnection. I think an important thing, and Dan mentioned it earlier, a parent cannot really attune to a child when they are psychologically in a victim position or practically in a victim position. They need to have agency in terms of, earlier we talked about that gap, coming back. They need to be able to come back. They need to be able to exist and have presence and a sense of agency and, self-efficacy, expectation, in order to be able to actually attune to the child. Because otherwise there's the risk of pretending to attune to the child. And an early pioneer of family therapy, Bowen, called that pseudo-mutuality. So I think in that sense, DDP practitioners will feel quite at home with child-focused NVR. I think there's a lot that NVR can learn from DDP, particularly in terms of mirroring the child's affect as a way of de-escalating at times. And I think conversely, there's a lot that DDP can learn from NVR.
Thank you, Peter. Dan, I think you're going to answer this next question about describing NVR in action.
Certainly. And as I prepared to answer that, I had two choices. I could either speak about a typical family or try to talk about the process, the way in which NVR works to achieve its goals in the way it does. And since as we joked before that, I think that none of us has met a typical family for the past 20 years. I will try to do that through by looking at NVR's a kind of a linear model of NVR's process and progression. Is it okay if I share my screen with you?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I prepared this single slide that I'd like to walk us through, and I'll do it very briefly. So, resisting harm in a caring way together in 8 intervention steps. I'd like to a word of caution. This is not like the 12 steps. Okay, we don't necessarily speak to our clients about steps or articulate steps as part of our explicit process. This is rather a linear and didactic way of explaining what NVR is about or how it operates. But of course, there are many exceptions, as many exceptions as there are untypical families. The first step we would call opening, and we have a challenge. Parents come to us many times with a feeling of being broken, helpless, despaired, erased, and the first thing we try to do with them is guide them from despair into trusting us, gaining their trust, and also into hope. So, in the opening stages of our therapy, we are very much focused not on doing anything or solving anything, but just on these two very important elements: achieving trust and seeing this little glimmer in their eyes as they leave our room for the first or second session, more hopeful than they came in with. Our next phase, once we have established hope, is to try to translate that into a plan. As you'll remember, we are about resisting harm in a caring way. And to resist harm in a caring way, this is not something impulsive. We need to learn how to do it. We need to rather restore our ability, our inborn ability to resist caringly. And this is done by planning. This is done by planning, not by acting. So we try to translate or use or leverage hope to make a plan of resisting in a caring way, whatever violent behavior there is. And on the way, we also deal a lot with the parents' fears and apprehensions and concerns about acting. This is a process of opening up possibilities and restoring the parental ability to imagine that things can be different and that actually resistance can be planned. Once we have a plan, a plan can seem very attractive, but we also need some intention to execute this plan. So we further work in order to turn this plan by overcoming fears and apprehensions and anxieties, and also working together with the parents. We work on forming or moving from a plan to an actual intention to enact the plan. Once we have an intention to enact the plan, and it's the parents' intention. But as we said, NVR is about resisting harm in a caring way together. So we move from a private intention to a public or a communal intention. We recruit, we mobilize, we rally the family support, social support resources to help it enact the intention and the intended plan. NVR has an entire methodology and practice of how to do that, of how to actually reach out into the family social network. Anytime the family is isolated, they're alone, we reach out for them, and we gather them into the process. Then once we have a public intention, we can move from intention to the first act through something we call an announcement, which is a declaration of what we are going to change from now on in our behavior in order to resist harm in a caring way together and stand for you, our child, you are cared for. The next step would be—
Sorry, Dan. If I just briefly
Sure.
interrupt to mention that the announcement is made by the parent to the child, by the parents to the child. It's a direct interaction.
Thank you for pointing this out. And after an announcement begins what we call the nonviolent struggle. So we move from one single act, which is somewhat of a ritual, but it's also the very first act of struggle, and we extend that, we generalize that into the new habits we have of resisting in a caring way together. And hopefully we manage through that to achieve presence, to restore the parental presence, to fill the gap, if you wish. And if we do that, then we can start talking about reconciliation, about healing the wounds of the conflict, the shame, the mutual pain. And very often we see NVR as a cycle. Sometimes this happens several times over several years. Clients come back to us. So just in a very brief way, this is how we see the process.
So once you've gone through this process, what do you expect to see as a result of the intervention, and is there any research on that?
Okay. Well, maybe if I start on the research, I mean, there are, I think, about 6 randomized controlled trials or more, and a far larger number of pre-post trials. Some of the randomized controlled trials are around a general population of kids with, controlling behaviors. Others focus, there's one on kids with high-level anxious behaviors. There is a study that very importantly for the adoptive families to know about. There's a study that investigated the outcomes of NVR for children who are looked after in foster care, so have a very similar sort of experience of high ACEs as many adoptive children, and so on. So, I mean, this is the sort of standard answer that one gives in this day and age of evidence-based practice. But I think the important thing to look at is that there are positive outcomes in different aspects. And we do see positive outcomes in the behavior of the children and in increasing well-being in the children. But also we see, parent variables. We see change in parent variables, parents feeling more confident, feeling that they are socially supported to a far greater degree. I think that is key. My personal view is that the degree of experienced social support in NVR is probably one of the most important, if not the most important, predictor of change. So we see improvement in those areas, and we see improvement in family functioning in general. So I think those are pretty important things, but I think important is also, what actually seems to change. What changes do we see in families? And I think, Dan, you were going to maybe say something to that.
Certainly. As we said at the outstart, NVR's main focus is on caregivers, and I wouldn't call it secondary focus, but indirect focus is on the cared for. Therefore, I think that most of the impact that we are sure of, that we are certain happens on parents. And it's the same impact that you can see, I think, when working generally with any victims of violence. People who start out the process, the therapeutic process, as dissociated, despaired, disempowered, and hopefully come out of it empowered, present, with a sense of agency, knowing what to do, knowing how to manage. From my clinical experience, there is a very high chance, a very high probability that if you work right with parents, they will reach that point. Of course, it doesn't always work, but I find that when it works very well. And then when you have parents who are more present and who are more empowered, that certainly affects the children. But the effect it has on children is very, very multivariate. It's very, there's a wide range of effects. There's an infinity of ways in which a more present parent, a more empowered parent can affect a child's behavior. And we hear about that too. But our main everyday work is with parents. And this is where we see, and this is how we measure our success, by the way. Our success is, if parents ask us, is this, how successful is it? I would say with parents, we are highly successful. And whatever benefit parents get out of it, they carry over to the children in many different ways.
Could I summarize that by saying, tell me if this is correct, that parents are moving from being perhaps more frightened or frightening to creating a more secure base safe haven, if we were to use the attachment words?
Well, if we are to use the attachment words, actually, I'd like to add Hein Omer's own extension to that terminology, the safe haven, secure base. And what he added to that is anchoring. Anchoring. So because secure base, there's an association of ships into the harbor, safe harbor, and the anchor is what he added into the picture as something that actually is also very important for creating attachment. The anchor that resists the ship's chaotic or disruptive movement sometimes.
Yeah. Can I add one practical consideration? What I often see is that there is not only a reduction in aggressive behavior in the child, but often a reconnecting between child and parent, and we see indication of thriving or more thriving in the kids. And sometimes that can also manifest itself as a willingness to enter into therapy in their own right or to work more productively. I've been working recently with an adoptive mother of two young women, older teenagers, and one of them who was, staying in her room all the time, staying up at night, smoking cannabis all the time, not going to school, disengaging from education and so forth. Much of that has improved, not perfectly, but she does get up before noontime now, and she is re-engaging, and she's smoking less cannabis. And last week she said to her mother, "Hey, can I talk to that man?" "Okay, I'll talk to that man," because the anxiety is really too much. So her anxiety had been kind of hidden behind her outward behavior. And now that front behavior has come down, she's become more willing to get some help. And I think that's a real aspect of thriving. But it has happened in the context of her mother telling me in regularly, when we have a session, oh yeah, such and such a thing happened, but I know now how to deal with it. And I think that is the key thing.
I know that we're rapidly approaching the end of the hour, for which I'm kind of sorry, because I think we could continue this conversation for many more hours. So can you tell us, please, what are the next steps and how do we continue this conversation for all of the professionals who are interested in learning more?
Certainly. I'm a newcomer to Canada. I immigrated here 2 years ago, and one of my missions, my professional missions here, is to disseminate NVR and train Canadian and also US-based therapists in NVR. Together with my colleagues and with Peter's great help, I am working on setting up the School of NVR Therapy and Practice, which will begin operating, I think, by June. And once it will begin operating, it will begin registering students or participants to an NVR training program that will be modeled after the existing UK training program with the necessary adaptations and modifications for the Canadian society and Canadian requirements. In the meantime, if anyone wants to contact me or has interest in hearing more about our training program once it's in place and it's all ready to roll out, I believe that Mary Jo can supply you an email address that you can write to me. Very soon we'll have a new website as well. So our plan is basically to train professionals as continuing education in NVR. There is an existing program. Later on, there will also be certification, but initially we'll start with the training itself and we'll grow from there.
And Adopt for Life is hosting the two of you on April the 22nd for a 4-hour information expansion of this conversation. There is a cost associated with that. You can find more information about that on the Adopt for Life website, but that time is April the 22nd, I believe 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I think Catherine is going to put a slide on the on display now, or at least, yes, I think you're going to put it on display now with lots of information. I really want to thank you, Dan and Peter, for joining us today. For our participants on Facebook, you will find that there is a link to a very quick survey in the comments section on Facebook, or you could also find it on the NVR event page on the Adopt for Life website. And we would like to know some of your thoughts. If you could please complete this survey. If you want to be kept in the know about upcoming events about Adopt for Life or NVR, please consider signing up to the Adopt for Life professional community. And finally, you'll see on this slide ways of contacting Adopt for Life or getting in touch directly with Peter or with Dan at NVR Canada. Again, thank you so much, Peter and Dan, for taking the time to join us today and to help Canadians understand nonviolent resistance.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
We really appreciate you spending the time. And please, if you're on the watching this today or watching it at some other time, please note the ways in which you can get in touch with us at Adopt for Life.